So yeah, from my perspective, this is really one of the most consequential elections in American history, and really could sort of signal the fate of the nation in really important ways. And you often hear that kind of a thing on an election day. It's the biggest election, that we've seen in a generation, or things like that, and that's generally not actually true, and it's kind of a way to get people to the polls and excited and activated. But we're clearly seeing that this year, not only the stakes of the election are huge, but the American people, I think, very clearly understand that the stakes of the election are massive. Over 100 million people voted before the election. That was an all-time high. That's partially, obviously, because of the coronavirus and the impacts that's had on the election overall. But it's also just, I think, a sign of how activated people are to get out and have their voice heard, one way or the other, in this election. And the expectation is another roughly 50 million people will vote today. By the time the polls close, so 100. If that actually happens and we reach 150 million votes, that'll be the most votes in American history for any election, and so it's consequential just from that perspective. But beyond that, I just think the stakes of the election really are unusual and not unique, in that there are really kind of 5 times in American history where I'd say that we've had one or more elections that have had similar substance with regard to the future direction of the country. And so actually, I just want to point to a book if people are interested in reading a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about. There's a fantastic new book by Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman called Four Threats, the Recurring Crises of American Democracy. And in this book, they suggest that there really have been 5 times where the actual fate, the future existence of the Union hung in the balance. So that was all the way back in the 1790s, shortly after the Constitution had been approved, and there was a lot of back and forth between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the first 2 political parties in American history. Then fast forward about 70 years, the 1860s, obviously, the Civil War. So the election of 1860 in particular, which has huge consequences, literally plunges the nation into a war against the North and the South, leads to the end of slavery, and actually the long-term consequences of those battles, both electoral and military, really set the course on the nation, on its course towards becoming a geopolitical power and economic power. Then in the 1890s, again, there was a great deal of populist unrest in the nation surrounding sort of income and wealth inequality in the nation that had been overlooked for a few decades, largely because everybody was doing really well. The economy was growing very fast, but by the late 1890s, that had really changed, and that led to the election of William McKinley in 1896, and then when he was assassinated and his successor Teddy Roosevelt came into office in the early part of the 20th century, really a fundamental shift in American politics, it's sort of in a progressive direction. And then obviously in the 1930s, came very close to potentially another civil war, with a quarter of the population out of work, the Republican Party in power that really didn't want to do much to help. And luckily, the outcome of that election was that Franklin Roosevelt was elected and really came in and probably beyond the 1790s led to the most transformative period in American politics, with the adoption of the New Deal and all the way through the next few decades to the Great Society and what all that meant for the nation. And then in the 1970s, obviously, with the Watergate scandal, there were real fears that this could be or could signal the potential breakup of the union. And so, I think we're at one of those junctions again in American history where the American people today and in the last few weeks have been deciding, do we want the American project to continue or or are we going to head down a path that could lead to disillusion? And I hate to say that the stakes are that big, but I actually think that they're that big. And I think that the most likely way that happens is not with a Joe Biden victory, because if Joe Biden wins, he'll win the popular vote and will likely win a fairly substantial electoral vote total as well. But depending on probably mostly what happens today, because Republicans tend to vote on Election Day, and we'll see whether President Trump is able to or has been able to activate his voters, and there'll be kind of a big surge of Republicans showing up at the polls today. And if that happens because of the institutions of our government, you could see a Trump very narrow win in the Electoral College, while Joe Biden wins by 3, 4, 5% nationally. And I think what that would lead to is, it would build on the disenchantment that began in 2016, to some degree really began in 2000 with George W. Bush's victory over Al Gore in the Electoral College, despite the fact that he won the popular vote. And I think the real possibility that large, progressive, urban states might seriously start considering whether remaining part of the American Union makes sense for them anymore, given how little power they have in national government. So the re-election of a minority president could really be a nail in the coffin of the American project. And a bunch of states, California being probably the most prominent, already a third of Californians think that California would be better off as an independent country. And remember, it's got like the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world if it were an independent country. So it's a quite large place, relatively well off. And so, I think there's a real threat here if President Trump is able to win the election because of our institution, the Electoral College, which allows for minority presidents to be elected. And if that happens, I think there's some real danger in that. So that's kind of, for me, the historical stakes of what's going on. So my sense is, so first of all, I want to suggest to people that you should not really, people are probably going to be on social media today. They're, if they watch cable news, which I would recommend that they don't do, but if they watch cable news, they'll hear political pundits sort of talking over the course of the day about what they think might happen at the end of the day. And the reality is, most of that should just be ignored. And so to the degree that you can, after watching this, just stay off of social media and stay off of sort of news sites and cable news, through at least 7 p.m. I think that for everybody's sanity, that's probably a good idea, because quite honestly, the analyses that happen on an election day are largely based on kind of how many people are in line in Dade County, Florida, and what might that mean for the election? And to be honest, there's no methodological rigor to sort of gauging how many people are in a voting line and what that might mean for the election outcome. Similarly, exit polls, which at the best of times are not terribly good metrics for gauging what might happen as the night wears on, as we saw in 2000 when the exit polls showed that Al Gore was going to win a clear victory in Florida, and then that wound up not being the case, and it was a very close election, and this year is even more tricky because 2/3 of the electorate isn't voting in person. So an exit poll of 1/5 of the electorate is going to show very little, and in fact would very likely show a big Trump victory, because it's more likely that large numbers of Republicans vote in person today. So again, I kind of would, to the degree you can, stay off Twitter, stay off Facebook. Don't get yourself dragged into those kinds of debates. And then for me, so what I'm looking for really starts when the first polls close, which is at 7 p.m. And so, and then sort of upside downside is that the 3 of the first states to close are amongst the most consequential. So Florida and Georgia both close at 7 p.m. And then North Carolina closes at 7:30 p.m. And we'll have a somewhat of a sense of where the election's going based on the results that are coming out of those states, and particularly if there's an early call in one of those states, and an early call probably means 10, 11 p.m. I mean, so it's going to take several hours for the vote to come in. And so if you're a Biden supporter and Biden is declared the winner in one of those 3 states, again, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, then the election is probably over. Now, the networks, the AP, might not call the election until early morning or sometime the next day. But his chances of winning, if he can take one of those southeastern states, that kind of they go through the roof. And there's a very high probability that if he wins one of those states, the electoral votes that he'll get from those, combined with what we think he'll win in states where he has clear leads, will really probably put him over the top. And so, again, if you're a Biden supporter, that would make for a short night. It would make it unlikely that the election will stretch on, or the sort of, not the election itself, but the counting of votes will stretch out for several days. Will make that less painful. However, if Trump wins those 3 states, then things will get much tighter. Biden's odds of winning the election will be closer to a coin flip, so it could go towards the president, it could go towards the former vice president. And if that happens, really, we're probably going to be down to looking at what happens in Arizona. So Arizona, the polls closed at 9 p.m. And again, so we probably won't hear for several hours where things are trending in Arizona. Again, if Biden wins Arizona, his chances then kind of go up quite a bit again. But it's not a done deal yet. And then people will be looking to 3 races at that point. So the sort of 2 smallest ones, but with Arizona could put him over the top, are the Maine second and the Nebraska second. And so it's worth saying a little bit, like, why are congressional districts relevant? Well, in the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska, they have not unique, because historically a lot of states used to do this, but today there are only these 2 states that have a different way of allocating their electors within the Electoral College. So the other 48 states and the District of Columbia, it's a winner-take-all. So whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes. But in Maine and Nebraska, whoever wins statewide gets all of the electors represented by the 2 U.S. senators. So they get 2 electors for those 2 U.S. senators. But the other electors within the state, they are allocated by whoever wins the popular vote in each congressional district. And so both the Maine second and the Nebraska second are close. Now, they're both leaning Biden. And so a combination of, winning in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then taking one of those congressional districts, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that gets Biden to a 270 electoral victory, a very narrow victory. So you'll be looking for those. And then, what's to some degree the nightmare scenario, and that's that Trump wins Arizona. He wins these 2 congressional districts, and then really everything comes down to Pennsylvania. And why this is harder for sort of individuals as they're trying to sort of deal with the stress of what's going on, and also just the nation as it's trying to figure out who the next president's going to be, is that even though the polls close in Pennsylvania at 8 p.m., it's very likely it's going to take several days to count all the votes in Pennsylvania. And so at best, I think we would probably know who would won the state of Pennsylvania by, Thursday, Friday, probably at the best. And so that's for some people kind of a nightmare scenario. Now, the polls right now suggest that that's not going to happen. The polls suggest that Joe Biden is up by 8 to 10% nationally, and so even with kind of the built-in advantage that more rural-based Republicans have within the Electoral College, that advantage is really only kind of 3 to 5% within the popular vote context. And so if the polls are right and Biden actually is winning the national popular vote by 8 to 10%, it's very likely that he's going to win in places like Florida, like Georgia, like North Carolina, like Arizona. And probably even Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania might remain the tightest of those elections. And so what we're going to see is whether the polls are off by as much as they were in 2016. Now, the reality is that even if they're off by as much as they were off in 2016, and even if they're off as much as 2016 in favor of President Trump, Joe Biden will likely still win because he has 2016 state polls were off by about 4% towards Trump. But in all of those states, so we'll pick Pennsylvania as one example, Biden's up by 5% in the polling average. So even a 4% error still leads to a slight Biden advantage. But again, would take several days for us to know what's going on. I guess just 2 other things maybe to say that people should be looking for is the presidential race is obviously not the only election that's going on. We're electing a Congress as well. So in the House of Representatives, it's almost certain that the Democrats are going to retain control of the House and even might augment their majority by a little bit. And so that, be looking for that, but there's not a lot of tension within that part of the race. But the Senate is completely up for grabs, and so there are a few Senate races that you might look at along the way as well. So at the same time, you're looking to see who wins the presidential race in North Carolina. The Senate race in North Carolina probably will indicate whether the Democrats are going to be able to take the Senate back. And so Cal Cunningham, who's the Democratic nominee, if he wins in North Carolina, it's a pretty good indicator that Democrats will win a majority. It's not certain, but it's a pretty good indicator that he'll win. The next one to look for is the Maine Senate race, where Sarah Gideon is up against Susan Collins. And this is going to be a slightly weird one because Maine has ranked choice voting. And so what that means is that Maine voters can sort of rank order who they would like to win, and particularly if they choose third-party candidates, eventually those candidates will sort of say they pick a Green Party candidate as their top choice. If that Green Party candidate can't reach a majority, those votes will eventually go to their second choice. And so say that their second choice is the Democratic candidate. What that will mean is that Gideon will get those votes. But none of that's likely to happen tonight. Again, we'll probably have to wait till tomorrow or even the next day until all of that ranked order voting, all those tallies have been done. But what you can look for tonight is if Gideon looks like she has about 47% of the vote, sort of the first order votes in Maine, it's highly likely that she's going to win that race. So that's what I'd be looking for in the main Senate race. And then you're going to want to look at Arizona and Colorado, where Mark Kelly and John Hickenlooper are running for the Senate. They're clear favorites, and so we'll see if they in fact do win those races. And Kelly, in particular, in Arizona, is quite interesting because there's a possibility that he kind of, because of the excitement around his candidacy, he's the husband of Gabby Giffords. If he can pull Biden to a win in Arizona, that'll be something to look for. And then there are sort of 4 coin tosses, most of which are leaning Republican, but they're really close. And so depending again on turnout, could go towards the Democrats. So Harrison in South Carolina, Greenfield in Iowa, Bullock in Montana, and John Ossoff in Georgia. And so those are all going to be very tight. And if the Democrats win any of those, again, a very good shot that they'll take the Senate. There's another Georgia race. There's a special election Senate race in Georgia as well. And so people might want to take a look at that. But just to be clear, what's going to happen there is it's a runoff, or it's likely going to lead to a runoff. And so there are, I think, 5 or 6 major candidates who are running, both on the Democratic side and quite a few Republicans. What's likely to happen is that Warnock, who is the Democratic nominee, will be one of the 2 top vote getters, and probably the plurality vote getter, but will only get in the low 30%. And then one of the Republicans, and there's a little bit of lack of clarity about who that will be the second top vote getter. They'll then sometime in the next month or 2 have a runoff election to see who actually is going to fill that seat in Georgia. So you can look at that race, but that's very, very unlikely to be decided tonight. And then the last thing I'll say is look at state legislatures. 2020 is a decennial election, and all decennial elections are incredibly important because the census has been going on this year. At the end of the year, the Census Bureau will tally the numbers and figure out how many people are living in which states. That then leads to the reapportionment process, where some states, because they've lost population as a sort of compared to the average nationally, will lose seats in the House of Representatives. And other states, particularly in the Southwest, will increase their overall number of seats. And the state legislatures are in charge of redrawing the maps, kind of regardless of whether you've lost seats or whether you've gained seats. And who's in charge of that process often gives you a sense of how well one political party will be able to maintain power in the House of Representatives in the coming decade. And sometimes this can have a carryover effect for several decades, depending on how the maps are growing. So I guess those are the big things I'm looking for. I will just say I'm a Biden supporter. I'm a progressive Democrat, and so I'm going into the election cautiously optimistic. I will say I was cautiously optimistic in 2016 as well, though, and I was wrong. And Donald Trump wound up winning a fairly decent sized electoral college victory despite losing the national popular vote. But all of the signs this year suggest that this is a really kind of different election, particularly because of the coronavirus and the economy. And so we'll see. For me as a Biden supporter, and to the Biden supporters who are watching, we'll hope it's a good election.